at the Global Microcredit Summit in 2006 in Halifax, Canada. In 1999, she gave loans to 50 beggars in one of the worst slums of Nairobi, Mathare Valley slum, not intending to start an organization, not intending to go beyond the 50 beggars, the 50 women. 8 years later, she had 170,000 savers and 60,000 borrowers. And in Halifax, she would put the face of one of her clients on the screen and say, we have fast climbers out of poverty and we have slow climbers out of poverty, but everyone's a climber. This is one of our fast climbers. She was one of the original 50 beggars. She now has 6 businesses and 62 employees. And this is the one that gets me. She said, this is another of our fast climbers. He was a thief. He was one of the most wanted criminals in the slum. His first loan was for $20. He has 4 businesses, and he's convinced hundreds of youth to get out of crime. Do you see the revolution here? Do you see the rules Ingrid's breaking? You don't give loans to beggars in urban slums in Africa. You don't give loans to thieves anywhere. There is still some nonsense going around that says you cannot reach the very poor with microcredit. You can only reach the economically active poor. I think in this video, and I think in this story, we've seen otherwise. Let's take a look for a moment at how microfinance can contribute to fulfilling the Millennium Development Goals. These goals are only measured nationally. So when considering this question, I believe it's important to look at the world's most saturated microfinance market, Bangladesh, not because it's an absolute predictor of what will happen in other countries, but it's a predictor of what could happen elsewhere if developed with the same care that's been applied there. In 1974, then U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger called the recently independent Bangladesh, quote, a bottomless basket case, end of quote. Indeed, the country's war of independence brought famine and devastation. Now, 34 years later, and 32 years since the first microloans were made to 42 desperately poor individuals, the 3 largest MFIs in Bangladesh reach nearly 20 million clients, affecting 100 million family members in a country with more than 140 million people. Now consider the following changes in that country. I'm not saying as a result of microcredit, but it certainly played a role. By 2004, Bangladesh had already achieved the Millennium Development Goal on gender parity at the primary school and secondary school levels. The fertility rate in Bangladesh had been cut in half from 6.4 births per woman to 3.2, and in Grameen and brackets lower than that. That's cut in half from 6.4 to 3.2 births per woman. The number of child deaths has fallen from 239 per thousand, that's about 1 in 4 children born dying by the age of 5, to 77 in 2004. That's from 1 in 4 to about 1 in 12. More than 13,000 women have been elected to village local government positions. And Bangladesh has overtaken India in reducing child mortality in its rate of reduction. Had India matched Bangladesh's rate of reduction in child mortality over the past decade, 750,000 fewer children would die each year in India. Now, is all of this solely the result of massive expansion of microcredit? No. But neither is it solely the result of highly effective government programs. BRAC, for example, had to create 35,000 schools, one-room schools, for those students who never made it to first grade, kind of catch-up schools, children who were old enough for 4th grade but never made it to first grade. Grameen Bank borrowers created similar schools for their own children. Would the progress that I've mentioned be possible if microcredit programs never took root in Bangladesh? Not likely. Would the same kinds of progress been possible if only microfinance was available and nothing else? Again, not likely. I believe the critical ingredients to having microfinance contribute to achieving the Millennium Development Goals in a powerful way have 4 ingredients. Number 1, reaching the very poor, because the MDGs are all very poor focused. I mean, the first goal is cutting $1-a-day poverty in half by 2015. Another goal is to have the 72 million children who are not in primary school in school. Those are all the children of the very poor. So the first is reaching the very poor. The second is that the programs must be run well. I've mentioned this before. The third is that they must begin to include health education or other kinds of health access and other areas like health insurance and go beyond financial services. And 4, they must be committed to measuring progress. In other words, if you don't reach the very poor, or if your institution is not well run, if you don't bring in other areas like health, and if you aren't measuring some kind of progress, social progress, then microcredit will contribute very little to achieving the Millennium Development Goals. If you do take these areas into consideration, then I would argue that it will contribute profoundly. Let me very briefly close and touch on the Microcredit Summit's new goals. As you know, the Millennium Summit in 2000, heads of state and government from more than 180 countries adopted the Millennium Development Goals, beginning with the goal to cut $1-a-day poverty in half by 2015. In direct support of achieving that Millennium Development Goal on poverty reduction, more than 2,200 delegates from 112 countries gathered at the Global Microcredit Summit in Halifax, Canada in November 2006 and launched phase 2 of the campaign with 2 new goals. One is to reach, as you heard, 175 million of the world's poorest families, especially the women, with microcredit. The second, the harder goal, is to ensure that 100 million families rise above the $1-a-day threshold by 2015, which would lift 500 million family members out of extreme poverty, nearly completing the MDG on poverty. Now, we have a big challenge in measurement when we've taken this challenge up with support from the Spanish Agency for International Cooperation and Development and others. And we're working with 15 of the largest MFIs and networks in the world to find ways to measure progress above the $1-a-day threshold. If microfinance is to make a major contribution to reaching the Millennium Development Goals, we have to go back to our roots of rule breaking and innovation toward empowering the very poor. I've been with Muhammad Yunus when he's been asked, what was your strategy in founding Grameen Bank? And he would answer, I didn't have a strategy. I just kept doing what was next. But when I look back, my strategy was, whatever banks did, I did the opposite. If banks lent to the rich, I lent to the poor. If banks lent to men, I lent to women. If banks made large loans, I made small ones. If banks required collateral, my loans were collateral-free. If banks required a lot of paperwork, my loans were illiterate-friendly. If you had to go to the bank, my bank went to the village. Yes, that was my strategy. Whatever banks did, I did the opposite. And it is with that in mind that we remember that microfinance came about because the rules of banking were broken. And I'm most interested myself now in those who are now breaking the rules of microfinance and charting a path to the end of global poverty. I thank you very much.